is kind of the essence. I assume we're going to have some more people run in, but I know Peter has planned for our time. So let me go ahead and do a word of introduction. I am so incredibly grateful that Peter agreed to teach for us this week and next week. Peter and I were classmates at Princeton Seminary, and we figured we've not seen each other since we graduated in '86. Peter went on to do doctoral work at the University of Iowa and is a professor of American Christianity at Kirkwood Community College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Did I get all that right? And was a fellow church member with our members, Marilyn Greg Cornish. And one day I think I commented on something in Peter's Facebook feed, and Marilyn is like, "How do you know Peter?" And it's wonderful, sort of all the ways our lives connect. And Peter had put out that he was doing a Sunday school class for his home church, 4 weeks, on some pretty important topics, much of which we covered this summer in our reading of the book Jesus and John Wayne. And so I asked him, would he be willing to go ahead and teach us via Zoom, really on some issues about race in America, also about sort of the threat of white Christian nationalism as an ideology. And he was willing to go ahead and do that. Peter has two great young sons. They're not so young anymore. One's a college kid and one's a senior in high school. Is that right, Peter?
Both in college now.
Both in college now. It's been fun for me to watch them. And his wife is a high school teacher. And I just am so grateful, Peter, that you were willing to come and do this. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and let's go ahead and get started. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Guy.
Can everyone hear well? Is this good? Okay, good.
And I don't know if you folks in Nashville are Tennessee Volunteers fans, but if you are, I do want to commend you for the good victory. Any victory over Kentucky is a good victory last night. So in Iowa, we have this woman by the name of Caitlin Clark to root for. So I want to start out today by talking about the narratives we tell about ourselves. Recent battles over the teaching of American history are attempts to control the narrative. And narratives are important because narratives shape our understanding of who we are or who we think we are. Now, there are some folks out there who want us to use narratives that center the dominant people. They tell narratives that only speak of a glorious past, that promote a myth of American and white innocence, or that only present the good and rarely the bad. Or some people insist on teaching so-called patriotic narratives, patriotic versions, suggesting that our retelling of American history should only feature accomplishments that inspire veneration of the nation and its heroic leaders. As if the true measure of patriotism means turning a blind eye to our nation's past faults. The problem is that when we tell false or partial narratives, they often blind us to the causes of real problems that we face today, or cause us to neglect certain communities that don't fit the picture of the American experience. So we should be wary of versions of history that amount to cultural erasure. And we should avoid teaching versions of American history that promote a false sense of unity, that offer no opportunities for self-criticism. In essence, we should tell the truth when we're talking about American history. Now, we have multiple founding narratives that explain the United States. mini versions that I learned throughout my schooling. Sometimes they started with Columbus in 1492. Then maybe we'd move on to Jamestown in 1607, and then to 1620 and the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock, and then move on to 1630 and the Puritans. These are some of the narratives that I often got in my study of American religious history. But if we tell U.S. history through the lenses of simply these events, then we center a story of white European Christians who believe themselves to have been chosen by God to settle in the New World, to spread Christianity and European civilization. And if you believe yourself to have been chosen by God, it creates a permission structure to commit all sorts of atrocities. Now, a lot of narratives obviously will focus on 1776, an important beginning for obvious reasons. But in recent years, a native Iowan, Nicole Hannah-Jones, has challenged this traditional way of American beginnings by focusing on the year 1619, when a ship arrived in the Virginia colony with a cargo of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. Now, there are some historical problems with the 1619 project. The cargo of enslaved Africans, they weren't we didn't practice racial chattel slavery at that time. Maybe that was 40 years coming. And in her original essay for the New York Times, she overstated the case of why Americans fought the Revolutionary War to defend slavery. But the publishing of the essays in the New York Times and the follow-up book was really an important cultural event. By centering the Black experience, it pierced holes in the fabric of traditional white-dominated histories, where white Christian Europeans were essentially the good guys, a positive force for the advancement of Christian civilization. Thus, there's been a big political backlash to the 1619 project that I'm sure many of you are well aware of. Now, one scholar, Robert P. Jones, in his book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, he says that she doesn't go back far enough, that maybe we should go back to 1493 to understand the history of race relations in the United States. Because in 1493, the Pope at the time issued a series of papal bulls that kind of go under this title of the Doctrine of Discovery, in which he proclaimed the superiority of European civilization and Christianity over all other world peoples. And this doctrine of discovery essentially granted legal status and moral and theological justification to colonial conquest and domination. So it's Jones's argument that in order for us to really understand the mentality of some of the Europeans who settled in America and what happened as we expanded westward, we really need to understand this doctrine of discovery. Well, the great 20th century African-American thinker James Baldwin once wrote, "The American Negro has the great advantage of having never believed the collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all other neighbors or inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile, that American women are pure. Negroes have tended to dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing." There are plenty of scholars have noted that what what's really impacted us over the years is that we've had this kind of failure to really wrestle with the big lie at the founding of American democracy. In our Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, a persistent contradiction between the eyes of the founders, but between the ideals of the founders, and there's been this contradiction between the ideals of the founders and the reality on the ground. At our nation's founding, 1/5 of the nation was excluded on account of race. And the Declaration of Independence also referred to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and condition. And in the US Constitution, it starts out with the famous phrase, "We the people." And yet, the intention of the authors was that this meant primarily European, especially property holding men, but we the people, European men. Indigenous people were excluded from this compact. And enslaved Black people counted as 3/5 of a person for purpose of allotting state representatives to buttress the political power of white enslavers. And of course, white women were counted only for the purpose of allotting representatives. They couldn't vote or hold office. They wouldn't be able to vote until 1919. The 19th Amendment was passed. And Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, primary author of the Declaration of Independence, in his notes on the state of Virginia in 1785, he wondered whether savage people could ever fully participate as equals in American society. He saw the potential in Native Americans to become civilized, and he was impressed with a quality of nobility that he discerned among them. However, he candidly suspected that Blacks simply could not achieve the same standing. He believed that Blacks were inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind. And Jefferson's opinion regarding the inferiority of Blacks was not an exception. Many white Americans could not envision Africans as equal participants in American society with full citizenship rights. At the time, the description commonly applied to Blacks was that they were in a degraded condition. This was a term that was used by slave owners, and it was a term used by abolitionists as well. Very few white Americans expressed the confidence that Blacks would someday develop the intelligence and self-discipline needed for equal participation in a democratic society. Even most abolitionists worried about immediate emancipation. There were some exceptions to this rule. Benjamin Rush from Pennsylvania, Samuel Hopkins, who I wrote a dissertation on from Rhode Island, and a handful of Quakers. They were some of the exceptions to this general rule. And in the northern colonies, justice for free Blacks was set aside in favor of political and economic stability and the preservation of white privilege. Initiatives were taken to effect a separation of Blacks from the white population, premised on widely shared views that Blacks were untrustworthy and savage. Free Blacks faced restrictions due to their alleged inferior status, where they could live, the occupations they could assume, the schools that they could attend, basic civil rights like voting, testifying in a court as a witness, serving on juries, they were restricted from. Many white elites eventually argued for the expulsion of blacks, leading to the American Colonization Society in 1816. This was an attempt basically to sidestep the challenge, the very challenge of integration of a multiracial society. So when we look at this revolutionary period and the aftermath of it, this failure to envision the integration of blacks into a white-dominated society led to the ongoing practice of racial segregation. Blacks were not considered equal participants in the American project. Eddie Glaude, the professor from Princeton, has written that a value gap lays at the heart of the American project. That some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. The founders gave expression to extraordinary principles of equal rights, unalienable rights, and equality, and yet then betrayed African Americans by refusing to live by them. And this would affect the development of our country from that point onward. We could talk briefly about 19th century Western colonial expansion. There were two kind of basic justifications for this besides economic opportunity. One was to spread Christianity, and most of the founders had a view of Protestantism here, but also to spread civilization, i.e. white European civilization. And this idea of civilization included distinct notions about land and land use. Americans claimed land as rightfully theirs by enacting the belief that forcible occupation of land essentially grants ownership, especially when those living on the land were not using it properly. And because the Native Americans typically did not utilize the land the way white Europeans did, they didn't think that they owned the land, that they could cultivate it for their own personal gain, but they held it in common with the tribe. Europeans felt justified in taking away the land from them. This white European American attitude was that the land was basically empty or uncultivated, since it wasn't being used for private property. Of course, the greatest embodiment of this was President Andrew Jackson's policy of Indian removal, a policy that he spelled out in his 1830 State of the Union address, in which he referred to this as a benevolent policy. In this policy, he contrasted the wandering savage from the settled, civilized Christian. Note the presumption of white settlers as Christian. And he argued that a few savage hunters would be replaced through his policy by a dense and civilized population, which would allow settlements of whites to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. And he hoped that the Indians would cast off their savage habits and becoming an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. So he's expressing remarkable candor here, contrasting civilized Christians with wandering savages. But he was just expressing widely shared views that U.S. white settlers were a civilized Christian people who needed more land to develop their prosperity and expand egalitarian democracy. This gave rise to ideas known as manifest destiny, that Americans were destined by God, they were chosen by God to spread from basically sea to shining sea. This powerful framing of American nationalism presumed both whiteness and Christianity. So this, again, this reveals the contradiction inherent in the American experience, a contradiction that was born in racism. White settler colonialism dreamed of establishing an empire based on the principles of equality and democratic participation. Yet it excluded those who were deemed unworthy or unfit to participate in this privileged system. Again, this contradiction is present in our founding documents, that all men are created equal. Yet the unalienable rights were at the time only extended to white males. So Christianity was racialized to connote a certain way of living that mirrored white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. For most Americans at this time, Christianity equaled Protestantism, and Protestantism equaled civilization. Another part of our story is the annexation of the Southwest, the conquering of the Southwest. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but Texas was annexed in 1845, led to the Mexican-American War, which ended in 1848. And as a result of that war, Mexico surrendered more than 500,000 miles of territory. Now, if you were a Mexican living in this land, all of a sudden, right, the more than 100,000 Mexican citizens now all of a sudden became aliens on their own land. Many Mexicans in the newly added territories lacked official papers certifying their proof of ownership of the land. They had difficulty keeping land and maintaining their ranching lifestyles. When suing for ownership, Mexicans frequently lost in U.S. courts to claims by whites. There was a tremendous loss of wealth and property, loss of access to water and grazing fields. If you were Mexican American, you were now suddenly thrust into a new American racial hierarchy as second-class citizens. Protestant missionaries poured into this territory, and they viewed the Mexican Catholics as inferior, right? They brought with them notions of racial hierarchy, but also religious hierarchy. Attempts to evangelize the Mexicans represented an effort to civilize and Americanize former Mexicans. I mean, many of the Mexicans were seen as criminals, lacking in proper hygiene and intelligence. They were depicted as lazy, unwilling to work hard. In some cases, Mexican Catholic communities were compared with Sodom and Gomorrah. So Mexicans were racialized along with the indigenous peoples, right? To be indigenous peoples. They were dispossessed of the land. There's this famous painting that kind of expresses this mentality of the 19th century by John Gast, American Progress. And you can see, this movement from the east to the west, right? The east is shrouded in light, right? They're bringing aspects of civilization with them. They're bringing the railroad, the telegraph. They're bringing all this agriculture, and they're driving out the forces of uncivilization, Native Americans, and the wilderness, right? They're just kind of fanning westward and bringing American civilization to the West. Catherine Lum, and I want to talk a little bit here about how the term heathen was used during this time frame. Catherine Lum has written a book, I just read it within the last year, Heathen, Religion and Race in American History, one of the finest books I've read on American religion, right up there with Jesus and John Wayne in the last 5 or 10 years. And here she talks about how the concept of the heathen was used to distinguish between Christians and non-Christians, but also between civilized and uncivilized, that religious categories were racialized during this time, with the heathen being non-white inferior and the Christian as white superior. And so American Christians classified people as heathen in order to justify the taking over their lands, the enslaving of their bodies, and reconstituting their way of life, right? Whether it's Mexicans, Native Americans, the Chinese, and others. And it also helped to define the American racial state, justifying inclusion and exclusion from the body politic. She goes on to talk about the various hierarchies of heathenism. You know, some heathens were seen to be more advanced than others, like the Chinese were seen to be very advanced, but for Americans, you know, a lot of the Africans were seen to be less advanced. But even among the Chinese, they would hit a heathen ceiling, right? These civilizational hierarchies hit a heathen ceiling with the understanding that if you were not Protestant, right, if you were not a Christian Protestant, you could only advance in civilization so far. So there was this mentality in which they thought that heathenism led to a certain stagnation of societies, and that the heathen therefore required European instruction to achieve transformation. Now she goes on to point out that the conflation of Christianity with whiteness was never absolute. Obviously, people could convert, right? They could convert to become Christians. Yet the assumption was that conversion would produce a certain cultural and agricultural conformity, that you would start behaving more like white European Christians. So whiteness signified a superior status based on right religion. In this way, religion becomes racialized. Later on, the term heathen also served to mark off the boundaries of whiteness in the United States. Americans used the heathen barometer to demarcate the bounds of both respectable religiosity and racial identity for Euro-Americans of questionable racial and religious orientation. So you saw this bias early on against the Irish, right? They were seen to be kind of dirty whites. They weren't as white as English Americans, right? So you see these kinds of caricatures of the Irish in American newspapers and literature and the like. Later on, it would be directed against like Italian Americans and other immigrants from southeastern Europe who were largely Catholic or Jewish and not quite as white as the northwestern people from northwestern Europe. In the late 19th century, there was a great concern about Chinese immigration, that they threatened to heathenize the nation. And so one of our very first immigration law, passed in 1882, was directed against Chinese and Asian immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? There were efforts here to kind of preserve a Christianized America in which Chinese immigration was limited. So I want to go back to kind of shift my focus here. And you know, I pointed out that there's this contradiction at the founding of American democracy. And this set the stage for a repeated pattern in US history, where we had these pivotal moments of increased democracy, but that were then met with a kind of white supremacist backlash. right? Our failure to deal with this contradiction at the foundation of our country set the stage for a repeated pattern of racial progress and racist backlash. Failure to come to terms with our racial apartheid led to civil war, and it almost destroyed the nation. Now, after the Civil War, during this period known as Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, this was a time of heightened democracy. This represented the greatest expansion of human and civil rights in our nation's history. And it held out the prospect of a truly multiracial democracy. Black Americans were elected to local, state, and federal offices during this period. In the South, more than 600 Black men served in Southern state legislatures. 16 Black men served in Congress, and the first Black senator, Hiram Revels, was elected in 1870. Second Black senator from Mississippi, Blanche Bruce, elected in 1874. Do any of you know who the next Black senator would be after this time? It wouldn't be until 1966, Edward Brooke from Massachusetts. After the collapse of Reconstruction, it would be another almost 100 years before we would elect our next Black senator. There was a disputed election in 1877 between Hayes and Tilden, which led to there was a dispute over some of the ballots. Florida was included in this dispute, no surprise there. I think Florida was one of 3 states where there were disputes over the ballots. This led to a compromise of 1877 in which the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was installed in the White House. And as part of this agreement, he agreed to remove the last of the Union troops from the South, which amounted to basically white Northern betrayal of Black citizens in the South. This ushered in the time period known as Redemption, in which the white South created a repressive racial order of segregation with Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement of Black voters, lynching, white terrorism. It also included the promotion of the Lost Cause, which was a heroic interpretation of the Civil War in order to maintain Southern honor. The argument was that we fought the war to defend states' rights, to defend against Northern aggression, but not to defend slavery. Well, the Lost Cause propaganda campaign actually runs counter to history. As Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, said in his famous Cornerstone speech, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas of the U.S. Constitution. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. Now, the central ritual of the Lost Cause was the erecting of Confederate monuments. The majority of these monuments were erected between 1890 and 1912, right as the Jim Crow laws were really taking force in this period of lynching and racial terror. These monuments were essentially monuments to white supremacy, monuments in space to kind of underscore a certain racial order. At the dedication of one of the monuments, a monument at the University of North Carolina known as Silent Sam, Julian Carr, who was a wealthy businessman, said that at the dedication, the present generation, I am persuaded, scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race during the 4 years immediately succeeding the war, when the facts are that their courage and steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South, when the bottom rail was on top all over the southern states, and today, as a consequence, the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states. Praise God. Of course, by the end of the century, the infamous Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 declared that separate, but equal, this became the legal cornerstone of racial segregation in America. And I would add that Jim Crow was not just a Southern phenomenon, but it was actually a Northern phenomenon. I think a lot of Northerners, I was raised in the North, I've lived all of my life in the North. I think a lot of Northerners like to claim that they participated in a kind of racialized innocence, due to the North winning the Confederate, the Civil War. Northerners are not racially innocent in this regard as well. Eventually, the logic of Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned in the famous Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954, in which the justices declared that separate but equal is never equal. It is unconstitutional. And so Brown versus Board of Education mandated racial integration of the public schools. But again, this time of racial progress was met with racist backlash. The Southern reaction to Brown basically involved a lot of stalling tactics and defiance of this court order. In 1957, federal troops were sent in to escort the Little Rock Nine into Central High School. In 1958, the Arkansas governor, Faubus, closed the public schools in Little Rock and began funding of private schools. Between 1864 and 1973, the number of Black children attending integrated schools in the South rose 46%. Yet this then led to a rapid growth of segregationist private schools, right? So racial progress, racial integration is met with racial segregation. So between 3,000 and 4,000 so-called segregation academies cropped up in the 13 southern states. As we move to the civil rights movement, this was another time, one of those moments, right? If you recall Reconstruction, a moment of true racial progress, of the possibility of a multiracial democracy. A similar moment in American history took place in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s with the Freedom Movement and the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it held out the prospect, had we finally arrived as a multiracial democracy. You think about this, how long have we had a genuine multiracial democracy, right? If you want to date it back to 1965, that's only, if I do the math correctly, what's that? That's 59 years. 59 years that we've had a multiracial democracy. But then again, by the late 60s, in the aftermath of this, it didn't really solve the problem, right? There was the so-called long, hot summer of 1967, in which there were urban rebellions in 159 cities. In Newark, 26 people were killed. In Detroit, 43 people died. More than 7,000 were arrested. Nearly 1,400 buildings burned. This was a time of the rise of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party. They brought a new militancy to their movements, and they challenged Martin Luther King's vision of nonviolent resistance. And these movements, in part, were a response, kind of reflected the frustration of a lot of African Americans living in urban areas, the deepening of poverty, the chronic unemployment, police violence against African Americans. It seemed as if the civil rights movement had not brought the kinds of changes that were genuinely needed for the kind of social, economic uplift of many African Americans. So this movement was met with the presidential campaign of Richard Nixon, who emphasized law and order. And he developed his famous Southern strategy, in which he had these racist appeals to kind of white, conservative Southern Democrats, right, in order to peel them off away from the Democratic Party over into the Republican Party. Of course, many of you might be aware of, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, well, the Voting Rights Act, he basically said that I just ceded the South to the Republican Party. The last time, do you know who the last Democratic candidate for president who's won the majority white vote? That would be Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Ever since the signing of the Civil Rights Act, no Democratic candidate has ever won the majority white vote. And of course, then 1968, we also see the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. and shortly thereafter, Bobby Kennedy. By the mid-1970s, the Black Freedom Movement had fallen apart, basically. This campaign of law and order had produced mass incarceration of African Americans. We see the increase of the heavy-handed policing of Black communities, which we're still feeling the effects of to this very day. And it seemed as if by the end of the 1970s, conservative white America was reasserting itself. This led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. One of the hallmarks of his campaign was how he tapped into the resentments of a lot of white Americans. Shortly after he won the Republican nomination, he kicked off his campaign in Neshoba County, at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, very close by where some African-American civil rights workers had been murdered. And he knew what he was doing, right? He went to the Neshoba County Fair and he gave a speech about states' rights. And he went on to, affirm the value of small government. And one of the hallmarks of his presidency was his attempt to dismantle the welfare state, deregulation, getting tough on crime. Reagan attacked affirmative action. He gutted the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, all in the name of color blindness. And so for a lot of African Americans, this seemed as if white America was basically reacting to the advances of the 1960s. To a majority of Black Americans, Reagan symbolized the choice of white American to turn its back on the racial progress and great society reforms of the 1960s. If we jump ahead to the election of Barack Obama in 2008, this was largely framed as a triumphant climax to racial progress in the United States. Perhaps we as a country had finally overcome our racist past. And I remember the celebrations of a post-racial America. I can remember the headlines on Newsweek, I think it was something about post-racial America. But of course, this triggered a reaction, the racial resentment of the Tea Party. questioning of Barack Obama's birth certificate, even questioning of his Christian faith. And during his presidency, we see the murder of Trayvon Martin, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the uprising in Ferguson over the killing of a Black man. The election of Barack Obama and the Black Lives Matter movement was really a very important kind of political, kind of cultural event in American history. But I wonder to what degree it also then triggered this kind of white reaction, white fear of the possibility that there was going to be seismic changes coming to America after this time, right? Both the Obama presidency and the Black Lives Matter movement represented an important shift in the political climate of the country. And all the mass protests that were starting suggested that perhaps change was coming. But Obama himself proceeded with a lot of caution on racial matters. And many African Americans were disappointed that the change that they had hoped for didn't really materialize. And a lot of young Black people became more radicalized. They felt betrayed by Obama. Of course, then I would argue that the whole Obama presidency basically allowed for a campaign like Donald Trump's, right? His campaign exploited the racial anxiety of white Americans. He kicked off his campaign talking about immigration, talking about building a wall, talking about curbing Muslim immigration to the United States, right? So the fear of immigration, this anti-Muslim sentiment, these were two of the hallmarks of his campaign. And of course, his slogan, "Make America Great Again," which he borrowed from Ronald Reagan, offered this nostalgic appeal to a time in the past, before the 1960s at least, when people knew their place, when whites kind of ruled supreme. In the spring of 2016, the Public Religion Research Institute published a poll, and they asked Americans since the 1950s, do you think American culture and way of life has mostly changed for the better, or has it mostly changed for the worse? And I remember looking at this poll, and it was quite striking how it kind of triggered this divide among Americans. Those who said that the country mostly changed for the worst were basically white people, white evangelicals, white working class, white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, white people, right? 56%. Whereas Blacks, only the white college educated said it mostly changed for the better, right? Blacks, Hispanics thought that it changed for the better. There was also an age divide here. Older Americans thought it changed for the worse, whereas younger Americans thought it changed for the better. And there's clearly a religion divide, right? Catholics and Protestants on one side, you've got the unaffiliated on the other. And of course, there's a partisan divide today between Republicans and Democrats. Of course, then there was the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, in which Trump said both sides were to blame for some of the violence and the killing of one person. But during this rally and in the aftermath, and because of the rhetoric of Donald Trump, a lot of neo-Nazi white supremacist groups felt empowered that they had a supporter in the White House. And as late as 2021, in January 6th, Donald Trump, on the day of the insurrection, famously said, "And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." I would argue that January 6th and the big lie, right, represents an unfiltered attack on the US Constitution and American democracy. And of course, on that fateful day of January 6, 2024, again, we see the flying of the Confederate flag, right, gracing the Capitol building. So I am going to, this kind of sets the stage for next week. I want to talk about the prospects of a truly multiracial democracy and where we can go from here. But I want to, I think this is my last slide. Oh, I do have concluding reflections here. As Catherine Jin Lum argues, many Americans are unwilling to confront the gaping void at the center of their identity. Many today want to ignore or suppress aspects of American history that tarnish American innocence. They fear narratives that give voice to the experiences of minorities because they do not want to contemplate the big lie at the heart of the American experience. They prefer instead the mythology of equal rights and equal opportunity, and cling to nostalgic views of what it means to be an American. I would argue that we need to be truthful about our history if we are to move forward towards the prospects of a truly multiracial democracy. So I think that's it. So I'm going to expand. Do we have questions?
Can you, Peter, make yourself bigger in the center of the screen? Are there questions that folks might have? One perspective, I'll be right with you. One perspective that comes to mind for me is a couple of years ago, honey, when was that? We were on vacation, and on the 4th of July, we visited the Heart Mountain Relocation Center out near Cody, Wyoming, which was one of the internment center for Japanese Americans during the war. And that was a story I was familiar with, not one that Amy was particularly familiar with, but very, very important, I think, to touch base with those parts of our history. Yeah, T.
Slides on live false premise. Yes, a sign that I mean, at the end of the presentation, you start talking contemporary politics and how it's a big lie and agenda undo founding democracy. So, to what extent would you support, or what extent should we support the unraveling of democracy, or the unraveling of democracy, since it was itself founded on this big lie of racial harmony, exclusivity, and kind of falsity of racial.
Thanks. Did you hear that, Peter, enough, or do you want me to
Repeat it. I didn't quite hear it.
Yeah. So T had suggested that at the beginning of the presentation, you acknowledged that the founding documents had the break with we the people didn't include all the people. And at the end of the presentation, there was a sense that what we're seeing in the current political situation is trying to help me out here, T, at the end. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, which is founding the documents of the Constitution, that's something that should be supported because they had nice words, even though they were carried out laws, or should we start over again? Should we knock this down as somebody January 6th by and start up with something new.
So the suggestion was, because the initial documents were flawed, do we try to preserve them and make an ever better America, which folks like John Meacham would support? Or do we just get rid of them and start with something completely new? Is that right? Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems to be a big difference in what part of this we like, right? Of those founding documents worthy of support and renewal, or the inherent flaw, the referendum flaw, and try.
Yeah. So are the original documents so flawed that we need to get rid of them? Or do we try to live into the best, angels of the nature of the folks who wrote them at the time?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I would have a hard time scrapping the founding documents. I'm kind of a traditionalist in that sense, because I think there's some amazing aspects of these founding documents. One issue I do have with the founding documents, not only the three. I mean, so we have this amendment process, right, which helps us to change, right, and to address some of the contradictions at the heart of our democracy. So we do have the amendment process. Whether the amendment process could then overturn the aspects of our electoral college system, that would be, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I think the way in which people's voices today are represented in our in Congress, and then the way in which we elect the president, I would be in favor, and in consultation with constitutional scholars, of revisiting the way in which we elect our leaders. But I think the Electoral College and our system of representation ensured, at least for the first several presidential administrations, that slave owners would be, have the power. And I would like to see a more representative democracy today. How we do that, I don't know, but
I think part of my answer to your question, T, is, he started with, how do we teach history? And I think a lot of my early history was very much the bright and shining part of the history, and not anything about the shadows and all of that. I was a huge fan of Teddy Roosevelt, for instance. Love Teddy. And yet have to acknowledge that under his administration, or it was Wilson's administration, again, loved Wilson, but Wilson went ahead and said folks of color couldn't hold federal jobs, and completely decimated the opportunity for advancement of folks within the federal government who had been doing jobs as postmen and, all these kind of jobs. And it's, I think, looking at that to say, can we be better? Can we do things better if we're going to be all inclusive? That would be part of my answer to that question. That may not be satisfactory to you, but do you want to come back at all to this? Okay. Other questions? Anybody? Yeah, Diane? Deborah, excuse me. I'm sorry, Deborah.
What's hard for me to wrap my mind around people who come up with these ideals, that they weren't even ideals to them. I was kind of reaching out a bit. Was there some part of them that did know? I guess maybe that's it too. Maybe it's part of them that knew that this was right for all men to be created equal, but yet, no, we're the best, you know, whatever. Period. It's just, it's very interesting to think about, because, you know, you don't want to scrap the whole thing, because where would we be at?
Yeah. So Deborah's question, as I heard it, was as a kindergarten teacher, you know, teaching that these were wonderful ideals, but what about folks who didn't actually believe those or hold those ideals themselves? And I think we have to, I let you go ahead and answer that, Peter, before I jump on.
So how do we teach to the people who don't hold to those ideals, or what?
I said, are we teaching about people who don't hold those ideals?
Or should we teach? I'm not quite clear on the question. So should we not teach about people who don't hold those ideals? Is that the question?
I just think that it's hard to wrap your mind around the idea that these ideals that, you know, as a kindergarten teacher, I taught for many years, saying that we're not a perfect nation, but we have ideals, and these are the reason that this is always gives us an opportunity to strive for something better, right? This is where I always came from as a teacher. And I think it's really hard for me to understand and to think about that the people who came up with these ideals couldn't even live up to them themselves and didn't really have much desire to. Or the flip side of that is, did they kind of have something? They must have known deep down inside that these were good ideals, because that's why they put them out there. So there was some part of them that maybe they wanted to be that person, but they just couldn't, you know? So it's just very interesting to think about, you know, that we're founded on these ideals that were difficult for the people even who made them. Or is that less influence, I guess, is the other, you know, me seeing all sides of the coin as a teacher. There I go.
Yeah, I would add that, I think about, what would a good football coach or a good basketball coach, who's unwilling to correct the mistakes of his team, right? Shouldn't be coaching, right? And as a teacher, as an American religion historian, I never thought I'd be on the front lines of the modern culture wars. And there are attempts to kind of silence the teaching of history that looks at the negative sides of American history. And, so here we have the situation in which we have this nation that's built on some pretty incredible ideals. But I think then we need to, like Martin Luther King Jr. would have said, we need to look at ways in which we fail to live up to the promises of these ideals. And it becomes a very important teaching tool. So just like a good coach would correct the mistakes of his or her team, right? So we as teachers need to point out, we don't always live up to these ideals, but we're ever striving to have a more perfect union. We're ever striving to try to live up to these hallmarks of, hopefully, hallmarks of American society. Now there are forces right now in our society that are, maybe talking about trashing these ideals, or maybe trashing the Constitution, and there's a certain set of the population where these kinds of words are going to fall on deaf ears. But I have to believe that the majority of Americans are still of the sentiment that they want to keep working towards the advancement of a truly multiracial democracy in which everyone's treated equally.
Yeah. Peter, we're going to have to go and run to worship. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you next week.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. very, very different